Welcome back to Nerf Diagnostic and Repair. Today I've got 3 blasters lined up that I'm not actually going to attempt to fully repair today. I'm going to be using them as visual aids and as teaching aids. These all came from Afterworlds, and they have all led a very, very rough life. They've been through a lot of abuse in a lot of less than ideal situations. They've been improperly stored. They're full of dirt and pine needles. There's probably stuff living or dead in them. And as a result, they've lost their effectiveness. Now, none of these are actually broken, strictly speaking. They all still prime and fire. They all catch. It rotates properly. But I'd be willing to bet that if I tried to put any of these through a chronograph, I'd be lucky if it even went fast enough for the chronograph to even register. They all need a lot of maintenance, more maintenance than repair. So I'm going to discuss the sorts of things that wear out in these types of blasters and how those can be either avoided through maintenance or what can be done once it gets to the point that these are at. I'm going to start with the Fire Strike because it is the simplest, and all of the issues that will appear in a Fire Strike or similar single shot, muzzle-loaded blasters, all of the problems that will appear there will also appear in both of these. But there are then issues that will come up in revolvers that you won't see in either of these, and then there are issues with magazine-fed blasters that won't come up in any of these. But they all operate on the same basic principle as the simple Springer, so we're going to start there. So I'm in, and yeah, it's filthy in here. We refer to any of these kinds of blasters that use a spring to power a plunger tube as springers. And that is, arguably true, but when you actually take a look at the physics behind it and really analyze what it is that is propelling the dart, it's really compressed air. It's just using a spring to force a plunger that compresses the air in a second, a fraction of a second, rather than having something where you've pumped up a container with compressed air that is then released when you want it to. Here, the air is compressed as the plunger goes forward. And as the air gets compressed, it doesn't want to be compressed, and so it seeks the path of least resistance. And obviously things like the walls of the tank, which is rigid plastic, is not the path of least resistance. The path of least resistance is going to be out of the barrel, but we have a dart in the barrel, but it's only held in with friction. The dart is just pressed in, and the fact that the barrel is slightly too small puts friction on the dart, and so the air is able to compress behind it, and eventually the force of the compression of the air overcomes the friction, and it is able to then force the dart out. And that is what these are really powered by. So where do things wear out? Where do things cease to work as well as they could? Well, the most obvious one is, of course, the spring. And in this case, this spring is shot. It is rusty, it is corroded, and it has probably been left primed for a long period of time. And springs wear out. There's a process of tempering in order to create what is called spring steel, which is steel that resists being bent and will actually spring back to its original shape, as opposed to metal that doesn't want to bend, and if you try to, it'll eventually crack. That tends to be very strong, but eventually it gives way. And then you have softer metals, which, if you bend them, they just bend and they stay in the shape that they've been bent. Spring steel has the property of it wants to remain in the shape that it was in when its temper was set. But if you leave it bent long enough, it'll eventually lose some of that elasticity, that desire to retain its shape. And that's why they tell you, don't leave your blasters primed. And the downside is, of course, sometimes that means you have to dry fire them, which we also tell you not to do. So, it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But springs will wear out, and the only thing you can really do once a spring has worn out is to replace it. Some people will try to stretch the spring to make it longer, but that doesn't actually re-temper it. And generally, the first time you then prime it, it's going to return to where it was before. Because that is the shape that it wants to be in. It'll help for a little while, but it ultimately isn't going to gain you much. And unless you have the ability to re-temper metal, which I certainly don't have any idea how to re-temper spring steel in this particular spring, because I have no idea what the metallurgy of this is. you're pretty much going to have to replace the spring. And you can replace them with heavier springs, equal springs. That's entirely up to you. But springs are definitely something that are going to wear out. The same can be true of the catch spring. If the issue is that it's no longer catching, your catch spring may very well have worn out. That's less common, but again, this one is very corroded, which is not good for the metal. The next place that you're going to see failures are going to be in your O-rings. And oddly enough, this one still has lubricant, or had a little lubricant, and doesn't seem to be too bad. But rubber will rot. And it'll crack, and then it won't create a good seal. And the way to keep that from happening is to keep it lubricated. And also to keep it out of the weather. You don't want to have it, wet and stored outside and stuff like that. That's not good for the rubber. Like I said, it will rot and crack, and then you will need to replace your O-rings. In something this simple, those are pretty much the two things that are going to wear out. Other things that will wear out are, like I said, your various smaller springs, but generally it's going to be your main spring and your O-ring. The seal on the barrel is pretty much solid. These don't even have any kind of a gasket. It's just a friction fit. So there really isn't much risk of any of that wearing out. Generally, the other thing that are going to wear out for these is going to be your darts. Because these do have an AR, which are trying to push the dart out, and if your darts have worn out, they won't get a good solid fit. The option there is replace the darts or brass the barrel. But in general, you're going to be looking at the spring, because if there isn't enough power behind it, it's not going to compress the air fast enough to get a good solid pop and release. And if the O-ring wears out, then a lot of your air pressure is going to leak back out through the O-ring, because that's the point of least resistance. So the seal here needs to be more efficient, more powerful than the seal of the dart in the barrel. So those are the basics on your simplest kinds of blasters. So we'll put that one back together for now and take a look at the new complications that come up in a revolver. Told you there was going to be something dead in here. Alright, so let's take a look at the differences in revolvers. But first, a word from our sponsor. Yep, alright. So, the primary concept behind it is still the same. It is still spring-powered. It does still force a plunger. In this case, it's a reverse plunger, but the concept is still the same. It's compressing air behind a dart. The revolving mechanism adds really two new areas of failure, two new complications that you have to consider. The first is the revolving mechanism itself. And revolvers, there's at least 3 different kinds of revolvers at this point. There's ones like this where it revolves as you pull the trigger, and it gets into final position just as the blaster releases. You have ones where it rotates the cylinder when you prime it, and so everything is all lined up and you pull the trigger and it just releases. And then you have things like the strong arm, where it rotates after you fire, which is a whole new series of problems. But the revolving mechanism is something that will eventually wear out, because it is, again, a mechanical part. And there isn't much you can do about that. You can keep it lubricated, that will help it wear out less. But if something in that fails, then that's generally going to be a truly mechanical failure, and you're going to have to replace either the whole blaster or that mechanism, which will probably require you to take it from another blaster. The second new area of failure, however, is going to be the seal on the cylinder. You are definitely supposed to come out farther than that. What is your boggle? Yeah, we're just going to take you out that way. Yeah, the next area that's likely to have a failure is going to be the seal where the plunger tube meets the back of the cylinder. Because they can't be a physical connection like they were in the single-shot blaster, because the barrel needs to rotate. And so there's generally some sort of a gasket right here that presses up against the back of the cylinder and creates a seal that is strong enough to not be the weakest point. And so the air will still force the dart out instead of just escaping out of what's called the cylinder gap. But that can wear out as well. And generally, most newer blasters have a spring of some kind that actually forces that forward. In some of these older ones, it's simply the plunger coming forward that creates the pressure against the back of the cylinder, because there is still an air seal, and this is now forcing forward, and so this is forced forward by the air pressure, and that creates a bit of a seal. A lot of them will now, like I said, have a spring that actually forces that, and when the blaster is priming, that cylinder is pulled backwards enough to release the pressure enough for the cylinder to rotate. That is sometimes, if that spring fails or if that mechanism fails, the seal won't get broken on the back of the cylinder, and the cylinder won't rotate between shots. So that is something to look into. But in this case, I don't know if Mavericks just didn't have a gasket, or if this one has just completely rotted away. But that is something that you would generally need to replace, and it's usually either rubber or foam. On hammer shots, it's often replaced with like a little slice of Mega Dart, because that creates a decent enough seal. There are also rubber gaskets that you can get for, like, in the lawn and garden section of a hardware store, that's meant to create a seal on your garden hose that actually makes a decent cylinder gasket. But that is the next point of failure, the new point of failure that revolvers have that the other ones don't. That cylinder gap seal. So keep that in mind when you're repairing revolvers, that you may have to have a material of some kind to repair that cylinder gap seal. Let's move on to the most complicated one. After these Diagnostic messages. And Repair is sponsored by Foam Blast, who sent me this magnificent screwdriver in my colors. It's exactly the right size for pretty much every Nerf blaster out there, and I love it. Check out their website at foamblastshop.com for all your Nerf modding needs. Alright, we're now going to take a look. See, I knew there'd be something living in here. Murder you. Alright. Now let's take a look at the most complicated one. A magazine-fed blaster, which has whole new issues that can crop up. Alright, so as I said, this is by far the most complicated of the ones. In addition to having the whole issues with being magazine-fed, it also has a lot more locks, because they don't want you to be firing the blaster or pulling the trigger or having the plunger release at the wrong time, because it can cause things to actually physically break or cause things to jam and cause a lot of problems. So the locks actually do exist for a reason, and they can have issues, but they're generally not going to be the parts that have problems with wearing out over time. If they get gummed up, if like dirt gets in there, then they won't properly release when they're supposed to. Things won't move, and springs can of course get corroded and worn out. These are all, some of these are pretty bad, some of them aren't so bad, but there is some corrosion on some of these springs, and that can cause issues. And again, going in and lubricating parts that are sliding against other parts, so that, you know, cleaning them and lubricating them so they slide the way they're supposed to, that's good preventative maintenance as well. But we're going to take a look at the main areas, and again, it's the same as they were before, or it has all of the same issues that the previous ones did. Your main spring can get worn out from being left primed too long or being corroded. This one appears to be either not badly corroded or actually stainless steel, not sure which. But if it's left primed for too long, the spring will get weaker, and again, you may have to replace it. Most of the magazine-fed springers won't take a lot of the, like, K26 or K25 or any of those springs. You're going to have to get one that's specifically sized for it because of the way these work. But those are generally available on Amazon now, as well as, like, Out of Darts and Foam Blast and all of them. They tend to sell a fair... Now they're trained. Good Lord! Trains everywhere today. But there's lots of places where you can get the upgraded spring, and they're not very expensive. They're certainly cheaper than replacing the whole blaster, and will usually then give you a boost in addition to fixing any problems that you have. Just like the previous two, another point of failure is going to be the O-ring on the plunger head. Now, a lot of these magazine-fed ones, the plunger does not easily come out. It's got some kind of a cap or a lip that's on here. Some of them are actually solvent welded on, and some are just clipped on. This one appears to be clipped on. I'm going to see if I can get it off without breaking it. Looks like I might be able to. Oh, I was. Okay. So now you can get it off, which would allow you to clean dirt out of the plunger tube, as well as to replace or re-lubricate the O-ring on the plunger head. Those are exact same problems that we've seen in every blaster so far, and it's pretty much universal to any standard Springer. When putting it back in, you need to make sure that you put it in the right way, because it does, in fact, matter. Now, these blasters have an additional area where things can fail, and it is right here where the barrel is, the chamber, as it were. We have another O-ring, and that is because in these blasters, the barrel is not fixed like it is on a single-shot blaster, nor does it rotate like it does in a revolver. Instead, that barrel is what is forced back into the plunger tube to prime the blaster. And so there has to be a good seal when that is in place. So you have to make sure that that O-ring is good, because once again, if you don't, then that seal becomes the path of least resistance for the air, and instead of forcing the dart out the barrel, it'll just force air out around the barrel. And then you lose a lot of your power. Dirt in the barrels, that's another one that I didn't mention. If debris and whatnot gets into the barrel, it can mess with the seal on the dart again. It's little things that can make more of a difference than you'd think when they all start piling up. So if you've got a Springer that is just losing power, those are the things you should check first. Check your spring. You may need to replace your spring because it's a mechanical part. It will wear out. Check all of the O-rings that are in there, because those are mechanical parts. They will wear out. You'll run out of lubricant, and then the plunger won't slide smoothly. The thing will rot, and then it won't create a seal. Those are the things that are generally going to cause your Springer to lose power over time. And a little bit of preventative maintenance can help that. Making sure you never leave your blaster primed will increase the life of your spring. Opening it up every once in a while and re-lubricating the O-rings will definitely help. Keeping it clean in general will help. Not leaving it outside in the weather obviously is a bad idea. But when you find blasters at Goodwill that just seem extremely anemic, it's generally going to be one of those issues. Either the main spring has worn out or the seals have gone bad. So those are the things to check, and those are some of the ways to correct them. There is a reason that I got parts. Occasionally, it might behoove you, when you find a blaster at Goodwill that is very clearly entirely broken, to go ahead and grab it. Often, I have found, if you can in fact demonstrate that the blaster is physically broken, like you can take it up front and go, look, this thing is cracked, I just want it for the parts, they will sometimes actually sell it to you cheaper. They will sometimes give you a discount if it is very clearly busted. And it's worth asking. They might say no, they might, like, no, that price is the price, and that's fine. I mean, you're still getting it for a fraction of what they would cost new, and you are going to get more than that value in parts between, replacement bolt sleds, plunger heads, triggers, lots of little springs. In my last mod tips review, or last Monday mod tips, I talked about repairing posts that had cracked. And one of the questions that people asked, well, what if the top of it has been split or has broken off, or if it's missing? Well, you're going to need to replace that post entirely, and taking posts from dead blasters that you bought at Goodwill or that you stripped for parts, there's plenty of posts in here. You can cut that post off and transplant it into the other blaster using those same techniques. So there's a reason that I keep so many of the parts from blasters that I kill. There's a reason I have a whole bin of springs and a screw bin and a small screw bin and bins of dead shells up in the attic here in the makerspace. Because you never know which part you're going to need at some point in the future. So there you go. Some tips on diagnostics and maintenance for simpler Springers. Hopefully this was helpful to some of you, and thank you guys for watching.